What happened to the boys? Where did a 12-year-old king and his 9-year-old brother go? Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, the Duke of York, walked into the Tower of London in 1483 and never walked out. Their story became a ghost story, a mystery whispered for more than 500 years. But the question is not just who did it. The real question is why an entire kingdom let its princes vanish. Why did no one, not their mother, not their sister, not the loyal lords of their father, raise an army to free them while they were still alive? The silence is the loudest clue. And when you follow that silence, you find it touches everyone. It suggests a conspiracy not of a single killer, but of a whole court. A court where everyone had something to lose and perhaps something to gain. Number 15, why did everyone just move on? The last confirmed sighting of the two boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, was sometime in the summer of 1483. They were seen playing in the gardens of the Tower of London. Then, nothing. They simply disappeared from view. By autumn, rumors were already spreading that they were dead. Yet, no great army marched on London to demand their release. No powerful duke, a friend of their father, King Edward IV, laid siege to the tower. The entire English nobility, a class of men raised for war and loyalty, did almost nothing. This collective inaction is a fact, and it is perhaps the most damning fact of all. It implicates a whole class of people. Their silence was a form of consent. Think about the men who owed their titles, their lands, their wealth to the boy's father. Men like William Hastings, he was fiercely loyal to Edward IV line. When Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle, made his move to seize power, Hastings objected. Richard accused him of treason in a council meeting on June 13, 1483. Hastings was not given a trial. He was not even allowed to make a confession. He was dragged out to the Tower Green and beheaded on a random log. The message was clear. Dissent would be met with immediate and brutal force. This single act of violence may explain the fear. It paralyzed the opposition. It showed everyone that Richard III, the new man in charge, was not playing by the old rules. The other lords saw what happened to Hastings. They likely chose their own lives and the security of their own families over the lives of two boys locked away. But fear is only part of the story. The other part is self-interest. The English nobility had just endured decades of brutal civil war, the Wars of the Roses. Families were shattered, the country was exhausted, the last thing they wanted was another round of fighting. Edward IV had brought stability. His death in April 1483 threw everything into chaos. The boy's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and her family were deeply unpopular. They were seen as greedy upstarts. Many lords resented their power. When Richard of Gloucester stepped in, he presented himself as a restorer of order. He claimed he was protecting the kingdom from the Woodville faction. For many nobles, a strong adult king, even a usurper, was better than a boy king controlled by a hated family. They may have disliked Richard's methods, but they preferred the outcome. A stable kingdom under a proven military leader was a prize worth turning a blind eye for. They accepted his claim to the throne, confirmed by Parliament, in an act called Titulus Regius in early 1484, which declared the boys illegitimate. By accepting the act, they legally accepted the end of Edward V's reign. They chose peace over justice. And what about the common people of England? They had no army, they had no political power, but they had numbers. A popular uprising in London could have made Richard's position impossible, but it never came. The Londoners watched the young king enter their city in May. They watched his coronation be cancelled, they watched his uncle take the crown instead, and they did nothing. Your chronicles from the time, like the Great Chronicle of London, show that citizens were uneasy. They whispered on street corners. They heard the rumors. But they were also pragmatic. Their lives were hard. The concerns of princes in a tower were distant from the daily struggle to feed their families. They were subjects, not citizens. Their role was to obey the man with the crown, whoever that man was. Their passivity was another layer of the collective shrug that allowed the boys to be erased. So when we ask who is responsible, the list has to start with almost everyone. The powerful men who chose survival over loyalty. The calculating nobles who preferred a tyrant they knew to a civil war they feared. The ordinary people who were too scared or too weary to protest, they all moved on, they let it happen, and their collective silence created the space for a terrible crime to occur without witness and without immediate consequence. Number 14 was London's Silence a Clue. London was not just a city in 1483, it was a character in the story, it was a political force. The city's government, its mayor, its aldermen, its wealthy merchants had immense power. Their support could make or break a king. When Edward IV, the prince's father, first took the throne, London's backing was crucial. The city's money funded his armies. The city's welcome gave him legitimacy. The city knew its own importance. And in 1483, the city of London saw everything. It watched the drama unfold step by step, and its reaction was, for the most part, quiet acceptance. This implicates the city's leaders in the events that followed. In early May 1483, the new king, 12-year-old Edward V, entered London in a grand procession. The city officially welcomed him. The mayor and aldermen rode out to meet him. He was lodged in the Bishop of London's palace, then moved to the Tower of London. At that point, the Tower was not a prison, it was a royal residence, the traditional place for a monarch to stay before their coronation. Everything seemed normal. But then the coronation, scheduled for June 22nd, was postponed. The king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, began arresting and executing members of the Queen's family, the Woodvilles. He executed Lord Hastings, a man popular in the city. These were not subtle moves. These were loud, violent acts of a power grab. The city's leaders saw it all. They had networks of information. They knew this was not normal procedure. On June 22nd, the day the coronation was supposed to happen, a sermon was preached at St. Paul's Cross, a major public space in London. The preacher, a man named Ralph Shaw, declared that Edward IV's children were illegitimate. He argued that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry another woman before he married Elizabeth Woodville. This made his marriage invalid and his sons, bastards, unable to inherit the throne. This was the public justification for what was happening. It was a test. How would London react to this shocking claim against the memory of their popular king, Edward IV? The reaction was muted. There were no riots. There was no great public outcry. A few days later, on June 26th, a group of lords and commons, with the mayor of London present, offered the crown to Richard. He accepted. He became King Richard III. The city of London had officially endorsed a coup. Why did they do this? Again, pragmatism and self-interest seemed the most likely answers. The merchants who ran London cared about one thing above all: trade. Political stability was essential for business. A long minority rule under a boy king, with rival factions like the Woodvilles and Gloucester fighting for control, was bad for the economy. It meant uncertainty, it meant potential civil unrest. Richard III, on the other hand, was a known quantity. He was a 30-year-old, experienced administrator and soldier. He had a reputation for being firm and for upholding the law, especially in the north of England where he had ruled. The London merchants may have calculated that supporting Richard was the quickest way back to business as usual. They might have seen him as the lesser of two evils. There is also evidence that Richard actively courted the city. He offered them favors and charters, confirming their trading privileges. He presented himself as their champion against the Woodvilles, whom many in the city disliked. But their acceptance came at a cost. By backing Richard, they legitimized the imprisonment of their rightful king, Edward V. They gave Richard the platform he needed to rule. When the boys later disappeared inside the tower, a fortress in the heart of their city, the city's leaders were in a compromised position. To question the boys' fate would be to question the legitimacy of the king they had just helped create. It would be an admission that they had made a terrible mistake. It was easier and safer to remain silent. The Italian visitor Dominic Mancini, who was in London at the time, wrote that after the boys were moved into the inner parts of the tower, they were seen less and less until they vanished completely. Mancini noted the growing anxiety and suspicion among the people, but the city's leadership, the men with the power to act, did nothing. Their silence was not ignorance. It was a political decision. It was the choice of commerce over conscience. Number 13, could John Howard, the new Duke of Norfolk, have done it? When looking for a culprit, it helps to ask the question who benefited. Few men benefited more directly from Richard III's seizure of the throne than John Howard. Howard was a loyal, long-serving Yorkist, but under Edward IV, his ambitions had been frustrated. He had a claim to the Dukedom of Norfolk, one of the richest and most powerful titles in England. But the title was held by the younger of the two princes, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York and Norfolk, through his child bride Anne de Mowbray. As long as that little boy lived and his marriage was valid, John Howard's claim was blocked. This gives Howard a powerful and very personal motive. The disappearance of the princes solved his biggest problem. On June 28, 1483, just 2 days after Richard III took the throne, John Howard was created Duke of Norfolk. He was also made Earl Marshal of England. These were enormous rewards. It suggests he was a key player in Richard's coup. His support was not just passive, it was active and essential, and his new king gave him a very important job. Richard III made John Howard the Constable of the Tower of London. This is a crucial fact. The Constable of the Tower was in charge of the fortress. He controlled who went in and who went out. He was responsible for its security and its prisoners. For the period that the princes were held in the tower, John Howard was, for at least part of that time, the man in charge of the building. He had the keys, he had the authority, he had the opportunity. We have John Howard's personal account book, a rare and amazing historical survival. It details his daily expenses. It shows him buying cloth, paying messengers, and managing his estates. It also shows his closeness to King Richard. He was constantly at court. He was buying white cloth for Richard's coronation. He was carrying out the king's orders. The book's frustratingly silent about the princes. There is no mention of them. No record of expenses for their food or care, but this silence is itself suspicious. The Tower's own records for this period are also missing. The records that should detail the provisions and staff for the royal prisoners are gone. Was this a deliberate destruction of evidence? We cannot know for sure, but it is a convenient gap in the historical record. So we have a man with a clear motive, the Dukedom of Norfolk. That means he was a powerful nobleman, and the opportunity, as Constable of the Tower, he had access to the princes. And did he act on his own initiative, or was he following orders? It is hard to imagine a man like Howard undertaking such a monumental act without the king's approval. It would have been an incredible risk. If Richard had ever been challenged about the boy's whereabouts, Howard would have been the perfect scapegoat. The king could have claimed that a treacherous and ambitious constable had killed the boys to secure his own title. Howard would have been ruined and executed. It seems more plausible that if Howard was involved, he was acting as a loyal and ruthless servant to his king. He was the kind of man a new, insecure monarch would need, a man who would do the dirty work, a man who would not flinch from a necessary, if terrible, task. His reward, the dukedom he had craved for so long, could be seen as payment for services rendered. It implicates him deeply, not necessarily as the sole architect of the crime, but as a likely and willing instrument of it. He got his title. The princes vanished. The connection is hard to ignore. Number 12. What did Sir James Tyrrell really confess to? For centuries, the official story, the one promoted by the Tudor dynasty that followed Richard III, was that the princes were murdered by a man named Sir James Tyrrell. According to this version, Tyrrell, a loyal servant of Richard III, was sent to the Tower to carry out the deed. He supposedly arranged for 2 henchmen to smother the boys in their sleep. This story provides a neat solution to the mystery. It gives us a killer, a method, and a motive following the king's orders. But the story of James Tyrrell's confession is full of problems. It raises more questions than it answers, and it implicates the Tudor regime in a possible cover-up, or even a fabrication of evidence. The confession itself does not exist. No signed document, no transcript, no official record of James Tyrrell saying he killed the princes has ever been found. All we have is a second-hand account written years later by Sir Thomas More, who was a boy when the events happened. More's history was written during the reign of Henry V, the son of the man who defeated Richard III. It was a piece of Tudor propaganda designed to paint Richard as a monster and justify the Tudor claim to the throne. Moore claims that Tyrrell confessed to the murder in 1502, almost 20 years after it happened. Tyrrell had been arrested for a completely different crime, for supporting a Yorkist pretender to the throne. He was imprisoned in the Tower and, according to Moore, confessed to the murder of the princes before he was executed for treason. This is all very convenient. The man who supposedly confesses is immediately executed, so he cannot repeat his story or change it. The confession is not made public at the time. King Henry VII, who had a huge interest in proving the princes were dead, never announced it. He never produced the bodies, which Tyrrell supposedly knew where to find. If Henry VII had a sworn confession from the killer, why not use it? Why not hold a public inquiry? Why not show the world the proof that his rival Richard III was a child killer? His failure to do so is deeply suspicious. It suggests that either there was no confession, or the confession was not convincing, or it said something that Henry VII did not want people to hear. Let's consider James Tyrrell himself. He was a loyal servant of the House of York. He had served Edward IV faithfully. He did become a loyal servant to Richard III, like many others, but was he a ruthless killer? His career doesn't particularly suggest it. More importantly, where was he in the summer of 1483? Historical records show that Tyrrell was not in London when the murders were supposed to have taken place. He was in Warwick on royal business. He could have made a quick trip to London, but his known location makes him a less likely candidate for carrying out a secret mission in the Tower. So what if he did confess? A man imprisoned in the Tower, facing execution for treason, is under immense pressure. A confession could have been tortured out of him, or he could have been offered a deal. Perhaps he was told his family would be spared if he confessed to the crime and implicated the dead King Richard. We know the Tudors were not above manipulating evidence and creating false narratives to secure their dynasty. The story of Tyrrell's confession serves their purpose perfectly. It pins the crime squarely on Richard III and provides a satisfyingly simple ending to a complex mystery. But because the evidence for the confession is so weak and its source so biased, we have to be skeptical. The story implicates Tyrrell, yes, but it also implicates Sir Thomas More as a propagandist, and more importantly, it implicates Henry VII and his government. Their handling of the supposed confession looks less like the discovery of truth and more like the creation of a useful lie. Number 11. Why did the Duke of Buckingham rebel so quickly? Henry Stafford, the second Duke of Buckingham, was Richard III's chief supporter. He was his right-hand man, his cousin, and the key political operator behind the coup that put Richard on the throne. Buckingham stood on the Guildhall steps in London and gave a rousing speech to the citizens, persuading them to accept Richard as their king. He was rewarded handsomely for his loyalty. Richard made him Constable of England and granted him vast lands in Wales, lands he had long coveted. For a few months in the summer of 1483, Buckingham was the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Then, suddenly, in October 1483, he launched a massive rebellion against the king he had just created. The official aim of the rebellion was to put Henry Tudor on the throne. This sudden, dramatic U-turn is one of the most puzzling events in the entire saga. And the most likely reason for it is the fate of the princes. Buckingham's rebellion tells us that something happened in that summer of 1483. Something so shocking that it caused Richard's closest ally to turn against him and risk everything in a desperate gamble. What could it have been? One theory is that Buckingham was the one who killed the princes on Richard's orders and then had a crisis of conscience. He was a man of royal blood himself, descended from Edward III. Perhaps the act of killing two innocent royal children was a step too far, even for a cynical political player. The guilt could have driven him to rebel, to try and atone for his crime by overthrowing the man who ordered it. This version paints Buckingham as a tragic figure, a man who got in too deep and tried to undo his terrible deed. But there is another, more cynical possibility. What if Buckingham killed the princes on his own initiative? He had his own, albeit weak, claim to the throne. With the two princes out of the way, Richard III was a usurper. And if Richard could be overthrown, who was next in line, Buckingham might have seen himself as a potential king. He might have killed the boys to clear the path for himself, planning to dispose of Richard later. In this scenario, his rebellion was not an act of conscience, but the next step in his own ambitious plan. He used Henry Tudor as a figurehead, but perhaps he intended to take the crown for himself once Richard was defeated. This theory paints him as even more ruthless than Richard. There is a third option, which is perhaps the most widely accepted by historians. It suggests that Richard III ordered the murders and Buckingham knew about it. He was complicit, but he didn't expect the public reaction. The rumors of the prince's deaths spread quickly, and they were deeply unpopular. People might have accepted the removal of a king, but the murder of children was another matter. The deed stained Richard's reputation from the start. Buckingham may have realized that he had backed a losing horse, and he saw that Richard's reign was built on a foundation of blood and would never be secure. He decided to jump ship to get out before the whole regime collapsed. He made a deal with Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, and Elizabeth Woodville, the prince's mother. Together, they planned the rebellion. This was not a moral crusade, it was a cold, political calculation. Buckingham saw an opportunity to be on the winning side. Whichever theory you believe, Buckingham's actions place him at the very center of the mystery. He was in the inner circle, he was in London, he was with Richard constantly during the crucial summer months. He knew what was going on. His rebellion, which took place in October 1483, is the first major event that seems to be a direct consequence of the boys' disappearance. It failed. Buckingham was captured and executed in November 1483 without a trial. Richard III refused to even see him before he was beheaded. Was this the anger of a king betrayed by his friend, or was it the fear of a king silencing the one man who knew the truth of what happened in the Tower? Buckingham's rebellion and swift death ensured that whatever he knew, he took it to his grave. But his actions screamed that the princes were dead by the autumn of 1483, and that their deaths were the catalyst for the next phase of the Wars of the Roses. Number 10 was Lord Hastings' execution, a warning to everyone. The death of William, Lord Hastings, is often overlooked as a prelude to the main mystery, but it is a critical event. It happened on June 13th, 1483, before the younger prince was even in the Tower. Hastings was not a Woodville. He was not an enemy of Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In fact, they were allies. Hastings had been the closest friend and most loyal servant of the late King Edward IV. After Edward's death, Hastings supported Richard's claim to be Lord Protector of the realm. He mistrusted the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, as much as Richard did. He helped Richard intercept the young Edward V on his way to London and arrest his Woodville protectors. For all intents and purposes, Hastings and Richard were on the same side. Their goal was to manage the kingdom until the boy king came of age and to keep the Woodvilles out of power. But Hastings had a red line. He was loyal to the memory of Edward IV, and that loyalty extended to his son, Edward V. He would support Richard as protector, but he would never support him as king. He would not stand by and see his dead friend's son pushed off the throne, and Richard must have known this. This made Hastings, his ally, the single biggest obstacle to his ambition. A man who could not be bought, could not be persuaded, and was too powerful to be ignored. Hastings was captain of Calais, a key military post. He held great power in the Midlands. He was popular and respected. If he opposed Richard's claim to the throne, he could rally a significant portion of the nobility against him. So Richard acted with breathtaking speed and brutality. He called a council meeting in the Tower of London. And in the middle of the meeting, he accused Hastings of treason, along with the Queen. The accusation was flimsy, something about sorcery, but Richard didn't wait for proof or a trial. According to the accounts, he banged his fist on the table, soldiers rushed in, and Hastings was arrested. He was not even taken back to a cell. He was hurried outside to the Tower Green, where a priest heard his confession. He was then beheaded on the spot, using a piece of scrap timber as a block. It was a summary execution, an illegal act of political violence. This event is hugely significant for two reasons. First, it demonstrates what Richard was capable of. It showed that he would eliminate anyone who stood in his way, friend or foe. It showed that he was willing to ignore all legal process to achieve his aims. If he could kill a man like Hastings, a powerful lord and a supposed friend, in public, with no trial, what would he be willing to do to two defenseless boys in private? The execution of Hastings makes the later murder of the princes seem not just possible, but plausible. It established a pattern of ruthlessness. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it was a message to every other lord in the kingdom. The message was, stay in line. Do not challenge me. Do not question my authority. The speed and shock of the execution were designed to create terror. It neutralized any potential opposition before it could even get organized. The other nobles at that council meeting, men like Thomas Stanley and John Morton, were arrested at the same time. They were later released, but the message had been received. This climate of fear is essential to understanding why so few people spoke up for the princes. They had seen what happened to the powerful Lord Hastings. They knew that if they defended the boys, their own heads could be next. Hastings' death therefore implicates everyone else through their fear. Their silence was not just a political calculation, it was a survival instinct. Richard's first violent act in his coup created the terrified silence that allowed him to perform his second and final act in secret. Number 9, did Sir Robert Brackenbury, the Tower's constable, know more than he said? Sir Robert Brackenbury was the constable of the Tower of London for most of Richard III's reign. He was appointed to the post in July 1483, replacing the man who had overseen Edward V's initial stay. And Brackenbury was a knight from Richard's own northern affinity. He was a man whose loyalty was to Richard personally, not to the wider House of York or to the memory of Edward IV. His appointment put a trusted ally in charge of the most important fortress and prison in the kingdom. And inside that fortress were the two most important prisoners, the princes. Brackenbury, as the man in charge on a day-to-day basis, is a central figure in the mystery. It is almost impossible that the princes could have been murdered or spirited away without his knowledge, or at the very least, his complicity. According to the account of Sir Thomas More, when Richard III decided to have the princes killed, he first sent a message to Robert Brackenbury, ordering him to do the deed. More claims that Brackenbury refused. He was a gentleman, and he would not kill the boys. This part of the story, if true, would exonerate Brackenbury of the actual crime. But it does not exonerate him of what happened next. If he refused a direct order from the king to commit murder, he would have known the king was serious. He would have known the boys were in mortal danger. What did he do? Did he try to help them escape? Did he alert someone? No. According to More's own story, he did nothing. He simply acquiesced when Richard sent another man, James Tyrrell, to the Tower with a warrant giving him full authority. Brackenbury supposedly handed over the keys to Tyrrell for one night. He allowed the murderer to enter and do his work, and then he took the keys back the next morning. This story makes Brackenbury complicit, even if he didn't do the deed himself. He knowingly allowed it to happen. He was the guard who looked the other way, but we must remember that this story comes from Thomas More, a Tudor propagandist. It is possible that the story of Brackenbury's refusal was an invention to make the tale more dramatic. What if Brackenbury did not refuse? What if he was a more willing participant? He was showered with rewards by Richard III. He was given lands, offices, and money. This was more than the standard payment for a loyal knight. It could be seen as a reward for a special secret service. Unlike Buckingham, who rebelled, or Stanley, who betrayed Richard at the end, Robert Brackenbury remained loyal to Richard III to the very last. He fought and died for Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. This unwavering loyalty is telling. Men who share a dark secret are often bound together. If Brackenbury knew the truth about the princes, it would explain his steadfastness. He had hitched his wagon to Richard. His own survival depended on Richard's survival. If Henry Tudor won and the truth came out, Brackenbury would have been executed as a child killer. His death in battle alongside the king he served is a powerful, if silent, testament to his commitment. As constable, Brackenbury controlled the staff of the tower. He controlled the guards. He managed the logistics. Any unusual activity, like the arrival of assassins in the middle of the night, would have been under his authority. The secret burial of 2 bodies within the fortress walls would have required his permission and supervision. The men who worked under him would have followed his orders. He is a key link in the chain of command. Whether he refused the order but allowed it to happen, or whether he actively participated, he is deeply implicated. He held the lives of the two boys in his hands. He was their jailer, and he failed to protect them. He chose loyalty to his master over his duty to the prisoners in his care. His silence throughout the 2 years of Richard's reign, and his death fighting for him, suggests he was a man who took his secrets to the grave. Number 8. What was Dr. John Argentine's real role? One of the few eyewitness accounts we have of the prince's time in the tower comes from a man named Dr. John Argentine. He was an Italian physician, and he was one of the last people outside the guards known to have seen the boys alive. He was Edward V's personal doctor. Dominic Mancini, another Italian who was in London in 1483 and wrote an account of the usurpation, tells us that he got his information about the boys' final days from Argentine. This makes the doctor a crucial witness. His testimony, as reported by Mancini, is both heartbreaking and suspicious. According to Mancini, Argentine reported that the young king, Edward V, lived in constant fear. After his uncle seized the throne and declared him a bastard, the boy understood his situation perfectly. Mancini wrote that Edward was like a victim prepared for sacrifice. He reported that the boy spent his days in prayer and penance, asking for forgiveness for his sins, as if he knew death was coming. This is a powerful image, but we have to ask, what was Argentine's role in all this? He was the boys' doctor. He was tending to them. He had access to them when almost everyone else was being kept away. Did Argentine know more than he told Mancini? As a physician, he would have been concerned with their physical and mental health. He would have been monitoring their food. He would have been in a position to notice any changes in their routine, their guards, or their treatment. If someone was planning to poison the boys, the doctor would be the first person they would need to get past. His presence was both a protection and a potential opportunity for foul play. He could have been an unwitting pawn, his medical advice ignored. Or he could have been a participant, perhaps, using his medical knowledge to assist in their deaths in a way that left no obvious marks. After the boys disappeared, John Argentine did not suffer. His career flourished. He went on to serve the Tudor kings, Henry VII and Henry V. He became the provost of King's College, Cambridge. This is a very interesting career path for the personal physician of a murdered king. You might expect such a key witness to be silenced, but Argentine was not. He prospered. This suggests a few possibilities. Perhaps he genuinely knew nothing. He saw the boys getting sadder and more isolated, and then one day he was simply denied access and he never saw them again. In this case, he is just a sad witness. Or perhaps he did know something, but he was smart enough to keep his mouth shut. He knew who was in charge now. He saw what happened to people who crossed Richard III, and later, what happened to people who crossed Henry II. He may have made a calculated decision to forget what he saw and get on with his life. His survival and success would have depended on his discretion. There is a third, more sinister possibility. What if he was rewarded for his silence or his participation? The Tudors had a great interest in the story of the princes. Anyone who could provide information would have been valuable to them. Argentine, as a direct witness, could have told them what happened. Perhaps he made a deal. He told Henry VII what he knew, or what Henry wanted to hear, in exchange for a quiet and prosperous life. We will never know for sure. The account he gave to Mancini is all we have, but his position is unique. He was the one man who had a professional duty of care to the boys. He was the one man who could monitor their health. And he was the one man who walked away from the tragedy and lived a long, successful life. His story is a reminder that in the treacherous world of 15th century politics, sometimes the most valuable skill was knowing when to see nothing and say nothing. Number 7, could the boys have escaped? The entire case against Richard III or any other suspect rests on one core assumption that the princes were murdered in the Tower of London in 1483. But what if they were not? What if one or both of them survived? The possibility of survival and escape completely changes the nature of the mystery. It shifts the crime from murder to a conspiracy of concealment, and it implicates a whole new set of people in a different kind of cover-up. For decades, the idea of survival was dismissed as Tudor propaganda or wishful thinking, but the evidence is not as clear-cut as it seems. The most famous evidence for survival comes from the pretenders who emerged during the reign of Henry II. In the 1490s, a young man appeared on the continent claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two princes. We know him as Perkin Warbeck. What is remarkable about Warbeck is how many people believed him. He was not just some random imposter. He was accepted as the real prince by some of the most powerful people in Europe. Margaret of Burgundy, the boy's own aunt, publicly recognized him as her nephew. The King of France received him at his court. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I backed him. James IV of Scotland believed him, gave him a royal cousin for a wife, and launched an invasion of England on his behalf. These were not stupid people. They had met the real Richard of York when he was a child. They would have known what he looked like. They would have been able to question him about his childhood and his family. The fact that so many powerful, well-informed people endorsed him suggests that his claim was, at the very least, plausible. If Warbeck was the real Richard of York, it means the story of the murder in the tower is false. It means at least one of the boys was smuggled out. This would have required an elaborate conspiracy. Who could have organized such a thing? The boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, is a possible candidate. Perhaps she made a deal to have her younger son spirited away to safety in Europe. The guards in the tower would have had to be bribed or involved. There, people on the outside, a network of loyal Yorkist supporters, would have been needed to get him to the continent. This theory suggests a secret Yorkist resistance movement working to save the bloodline. But if this is true, it raises other difficult questions. Why did Elizabeth Woodville later make a deal with Henry Tudor and allow her daughter to marry him? Why did she never publicly support Perkin Warbeck if he was her son? Perhaps she was playing a long game, trying to secure the family's future no matter who was on the throne. Or perhaps she was a prisoner of Henry VII, unable to act freely. Her actions are ambiguous. The survival theory also implicates Henry VII. If he captured the real Richard of York in 1497, then his execution of Perkin Warbeck in 1499 was not the execution of an impostor, but the judicial murder of his own brother-in-law, the rightful King of England. This would make Henry VII just as ruthless as Richard III. He would be guilty of killing a prince to secure his throne. The official Tudor story is that Warbeck confessed to being an impostor from Tournai. But like the Tyrrell confession, this was obtained under duress, and the confession itself is full of historical inaccuracies. It is a document produced by the state to serve the state's interests. The idea of escape also has to contend with the bones. In 1674, workers at the Tower of London discovered a wooden chest containing the skeletons of two children buried under a staircase. They were assumed to be the princes, and King Charles II had them reburied with honor in Westminster Abbey. But we don't know for sure that the bones are theirs. Scientific testing at the time was non-existent. A brief examination in 1933 concluded they were likely the princes, but modern forensic science has raised serious doubts about those findings. Requests for a new, definitive DNA test have been repeatedly refused by the authorities. Until those bones are properly tested, we cannot say for certain that the princes died in the tower. The possibility of escape remains open, and if they did escape, the mystery is not who killed them, but who helped them, who hid them, and who ultimately betrayed them. The list of suspects would change, but the web of complicity and silence would remain. Number 6. Why didn't their sister, Elizabeth of York, ever speak out? Elizabeth of York is one of the most tragic and enigmatic figures in this story. She was the prince's older sister. She was 16 years old when they disappeared. She must have loved them. She grew up with them. Yet, in the years that followed, she never once, in any public or private document that survives, mentioned them. She never spoke of their fate. She never accused anyone of their murder. Her silence is perhaps the most unnatural and haunting silence of all. What did she know, and why did she keep it to herself for her entire life? Her silence implicates her in the conspiracy, at least a conspiracy of silence, that allowed the mystery to endure. When her father, Edward IV, died, Elizabeth's world fell apart. Her brothers were taken to the tower. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, fled with her and her younger sisters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. From there, they were powerless. They watched as their uncle Richard III took the throne and declared them all illegitimate. Their lives were in ruins. Then a deal was struck. While in sanctuary, Elizabeth's mother began negotiating with Margaret Beaufort, the mother of the exiled Henry Tudor. They agreed that if Henry could defeat Richard III, he would marry Elizabeth of York. This marriage would unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York and bring peace to the kingdom. It was a brilliant political move, but it was made while her brothers were still officially alive in the Tower. The deal presupposed that they were no longer a factor. It was an arrangement for a future that did not include them. After Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. He married Elizabeth of York as promised. She became the Queen of England. She was the mother of the future King Henry V and the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth I. She fulfilled her duty. She united the country, but she did it by marrying the man whose rise to power was made possible by her brother's disappearance. She lived the rest of her life at the heart of the Tudor court, the court that built its legitimacy on the story of Richard III's evil. Yet, she remained silent. Why? The simplest answer is fear. She was the wife of a king who was notoriously paranoid about his claim to the throne. Henry II faced multiple rebellions from Yorkist loyalists. To speak about her brothers, to raise questions about their fate, would have been politically dangerous. It could have been interpreted as disloyalty to her husband and his dynasty. She had a new family to protect her own children. Her duty was now to them, to ensure their survival and their succession. Speaking about her lost brothers could have jeopardized her children's future. So, she may have made the painful choice to bury the past to secure the present, but there is another possibility. What if she knew something that was dangerous to the Tudor story? What if she knew, for example, that her brothers had survived and been smuggled abroad? If she knew Perkin Warbeck was her real brother, her position would have been impossible. She would be married to the usurper who was hunting her own brother. Her silence in this case would have been a desperate act of self-preservation caught between her old family and her new one. Or, what if she knew who was really responsible for their deaths, and it wasn't Richard III? What if she had reason to suspect someone in her husband's camp, like his mother Margaret Beaufort? Or even Henry Tudor himself. Any such knowledge would have been lethal. She would have had no choice but to remain silent. Her marriage was a political union, not a love match. She was a Yorkist princess, a valuable symbol, but also a potential threat. Her husband and her mother-in-law watched her constantly. She had no real power of her own. She was a queen, but she was also a captive of a new regime. Her silence is a gaping hole in the historical record. She was the one person who could have spoken with the moral authority of a loving sister. She could have demanded justice. She could have told the world what she believed happened, but she never did. She played her part as the Tudor queen, the dutiful wife and mother. She let the memory of her brothers fade into rumor and speculation. Whether her silence was born of fear, political necessity, or some terrible secret knowledge, it makes her a participant in the cover-up. She chose her new life and her new family over the memory of her lost brothers. Number 5 was Margaret Beaufort's piety a mask. Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, is traditionally seen as a devout, pious woman who spent her life working patiently to put her son on the throne of England. She founded colleges, patronized the church, and wore sober, modest clothing, but beneath the pious exterior was one of the most ambitious, determined, and politically skilled operators of the entire 15th century. And she had one of the strongest motives for wanting the princes in the Tower gone. As long as Edward V and his brother were alive, her son Henry Tudor was a nobody. He was in exile in France with a remote and questionable claim to the throne. The prince's removal from the line of succession was the single most important event that made her son a viable candidate for king. This puts her right at the center of the web of suspicion. Margaret's claim to the throne for her son came through John of Gaunt, but the Beaufort line had been specifically barred from the succession. Or it was a weak claim, but she was a brilliant political strategist. After Edward IV's death, she saw her chance. While Elizabeth Woodville was in sanctuary with her daughters, Margaret Beaufort, a woman on the other side of the Civil War, made contact. She used her personal physician, a man named Louis of Caerleon, as a secret go-between to communicate with the Queen's physician. This is a documented fact. While the princes were still alive in the Tower, Margaret Beaufort was already plotting with their mother to marry her son to their sister. This was an audacious plan. It was a plan to unite the houses of York and Lancaster and create a new dynasty. But the plan only worked if the two Yorkist princes were out of the picture. Think about the timing. The negotiations between these two powerful women were taking place in the summer and early autumn of 1483. This is the exact period when the princes disappeared. It is the exact period when Buckingham's rebellion, a rebellion in favor of Henry Tudor, was being planned. Margaret Beaufort was a key player in that rebellion. She was coordinating with Buckingham and with her son in France. She was at the heart of the conspiracy to overthrow Richard III. Did that conspiracy also involve a plan to eliminate the princes? It is a chilling thought. The two mothers, Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort, making a deal for the future that required the sacrifice of the children. And Margaret Beaufort had the motive. Her son's entire future depended on it. She also had the opportunity to conspire. She was in England at court. She had networks of loyal servants and agents. She had money. She was working closely with the Duke of Buckingham, a man with access to Richard III's inner circle. Could she have been the mastermind behind the whole plot? Could she have persuaded Buckingham to act, perhaps promising him great rewards in a future Tudor kingdom? It is a theory that makes a lot of sense of Buckingham's otherwise bizarre rebellion. Perhaps he was not acting on Richard's orders or for himself, but on behalf of the Tudor faction with Margaret as his handler. After her son became King Henry VII, Margaret Beaufort became the most powerful woman in England. She was known as My Lady the King's Mother. She had enormous influence and wealth, and she, like everyone else, was publicly silent about the fate of the princes. Her son's official story was that Richard III had killed them. This was the narrative that legitimized his own reign. Margaret had every reason to support that story. Any other explanation would have raised awkward questions about her own activities in 1483. In her piety and good works in later life could be seen as the genuine devotion of a religious woman, or they could be seen as the actions of a woman trying to atone for a terrible sin, a woman trying to buy her way into heaven after engaging in a deadly political game on earth. Her actions in 1483 implicate her deeply. She was not a passive observer. She was an active, ambitious player who stood to gain more than almost anyone from the disappearance of the two boys. Number 4. Did Henry Tudor have more to gain from their deaths? Richard III is the traditional villain of the story, but an objective look at the political situation in 1483 shows that Henry Tudor, the future King Henry VII, had just as much, if not more, to gain from the princes' deaths. In fact, their disappearance was the event that transformed him from an obscure exile into a credible contender for the English crown. As long as the princes were alive, they were the focus of Yorkist loyalty. Any rebellion against Richard III would have been aimed at restoring Edward V to the throne. In this scenario, Henry Tudor was irrelevant. He was the leader of a defeated Lancastrian faction with a very weak claim. But with the princes gone, the political landscape changed dramatically. Richard III was a usurper, and now, according to the rumors, a child killer. This made him a deeply unpopular king. The Yorkists who could not stomach Richard needed a new candidate to rally around. The prince's sister, Elizabeth of York, was now the symbolic head of the House of York. The deal to marry her to Henry Tudor suddenly became a masterstroke. It meant that Henry could now present himself not as a Lancastrian conqueror, but as the uniter of both houses. He was coming to save England from a tyrant, and to claim the throne in right of his wife as well as his own blood. The death of the princes was the key that unlocked this entire strategy. Without it, the Tudor dynasty would likely have never happened. So, did Henry Tudor have them killed? This is the most extreme version of the theory. It would have required him to have secret agents in England, capable of infiltrating the Tower of London and carrying out a covert operation. This is not impossible. He had a network of supporters run by his mother, Margaret Beaufort. A plot could have been hatched. The goal would be to murder the princes and then blame Richard III for the crime. This would destroy Richard's reputation and pave the way for a Tudor invasion. It is a deeply cynical theory, but it is not out of the question in the brutal world of 15th century power politics. A more likely scenario is that Henry and his mother simply took advantage of the situation. They may have heard the rumors that Richard had killed the boys. They had no proof, but the rumor itself was a powerful weapon. They began to spread it and use it as propaganda. Their message was simple: Richard is a monster who kills children. I, Henry Tudor, will be your savior. In this version, Henry is not the murderer, but a brilliant opportunist who used a crime committed by his enemy to his own advantage. This still implicates him in a moral sense. He built his career on the graves of 2 children, using their tragedy as a stepping stone to power. The strongest evidence against Henry is his own behavior once he became king. He never conducted a proper public investigation into the disappearance of the princes. He was in a position to find out the truth. He could have interrogated the Tower staff. He could have offered rewards for information. He could have put the surviving members of Richard III's government on trial. He did none of these things. He simply pushed the story via his historians and propagandists that Richard did it. He declared Richard a tyrant in his first parliament, but the act of attainder against Richard does not list the murder of the princes among his crimes. This is a strange omission if he had proof. Then there is the issue of the so-called confession of James Tyrrell in 1502. As discussed, Henry VII's failure to publicize this confession at the time is deeply suspicious. If he had solid proof, he would have used it to silence the Yorkist pretenders who were challenging his reign. His strange reluctance to investigate, his reliance on propaganda instead of evidence, and his odd handling of the Tyrrell case all suggest he had something to hide. Perhaps he did not want a real investigation because he did not know who was responsible, and the truth might turn out to be inconvenient. Or perhaps he didn't want an investigation because he already knew the truth, and it pointed not to Richard, but to his own allies or even to himself. His entire reign was built on the foundation of the prince's disappearance. He had the most to gain, and his subsequent actions seem focused more on managing the narrative than on discovering the truth. Number 3. Why did the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, surrender her younger son? This is perhaps the most heartbreaking and perplexing moment in the entire saga. On April 30th, 1483, after her brother-in-law Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had arrested her brother and son, Queen Elizabeth Woodville fled in terror. She took her younger son, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, and her 5 daughters and sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. Sanctuary was a sacred protection. Armed men were not supposed to enter and drag people out. It was her one safe place. Her older son, the new King Edward V, was already under Richard's control and was being housed in the Tower. But as long as she held on to the younger son, Richard of York, she had a crucial bargaining chip. There were 2 heirs. Richard's power was not absolute, but on June 16, 1483, she gave him up. Richard of Gloucester surrounded the sanctuary with his troops. He did not invade it, but the threat was clear. He then sent in the Archbishop of Canterbury to persuade the Queen to release her son. The argument was that the young king was lonely in the Tower and needed his brother for a companion, and that it was unthinkable to keep the Duke of York in sanctuary as if he were a criminal. It was a matter of national honor that he be with his brother as they prepared for the coronation. The Archbishop gave his personal guarantee that the boy would be safe. After a long and apparently emotional debate, Elizabeth Woodville agreed. She walked her son out of the sanctuary and handed him over. He was taken to the Tower to join his brother. They were never seen in public again. Why did she do it? This action has been debated for centuries. Was she a terrified mother, breaking under immense psychological pressure and threats? Was she a naive woman who trusted the word of an archbishop and believed her brother-in-law's promises? This is the most charitable interpretation. She was a woman alone. Her family had been arrested. Her friends had been neutralized. She was faced with armed men and the highest churchmen in the land, telling her she was being unreasonable. Perhaps she simply crumbled, but Elizabeth Woodville was not a naive woman. She was a tough, politically astute survivor. She had navigated the treacherous court of Edward IV for years. She had seen men betray and kill each other. It is hard to believe she would have simply trusted Richard of Gloucester, the man who had just arrested her brother and son. This leads to a more disturbing possibility. Did she make a calculated deal? Perhaps she was promised that if she cooperated, if she handed over the boy, she and her daughters would be spared and well cared for. She might have decided that she could not save both sons. They were doomed. So, she sacrificed the son she had for the sake of the daughters she could protect. It would have been a horrific, cold-blooded choice. A mother choosing to save some of her children by abandoning another to his fate. There is also the evidence of her later actions. While still in sanctuary, she began plotting with Margaret Beaufort. She agreed to betroth her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, to Henry Tudor. This plan was her path back to power. By marrying her daughter to the next king, she would become the Queen Mother. But this plan only worked if her sons were no longer in the equation. Did she hand over her younger son knowing it was a death sentence because it was the necessary first step in a new plan to secure her family's future through her daughter? This theory paints her as a ruthless political player, as ambitious and as cold as any of the men around her. Her decision to surrender her son was the point of no return. It was the moment the two princes were finally united in one place, under the complete control of their uncle. It made whatever happened next possible. If she had kept Richard of York in sanctuary, the story would have been very different. Her motivations will always be debated. Was she a victim or a collaborator, a grieving mother, or a political realist? Whatever the answer, her decision to open the door of the sanctuary and let her son walk out into the arms of his enemies is a moment of profound and tragic complicity. She had a choice, and the choice she made sealed her son's fate. Number 2, did Richard III have to kill him to be king? Richard III is the traditional suspect. For more than 500 years, he has been accused of the crime. The case against him is straightforward and compelling. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. He was the one who stood to gain the most in the short term. He was the boy's uncle and their legal protector. He took them into his custody. He placed them in the Tower, and they disappeared on his watch. As the man in charge, he bears the ultimate responsibility for their welfare. His failure to protect them, at the very least, makes him guilty of criminal negligence. But the case for his direct involvement in their murder is also very strong. The motive is obvious. As long as his nephews lived, his claim to the throne was insecure. Even though he had them declared illegitimate by the Act of Titulus Regius, this could always be reversed by a future parliament. The boys remained a potent symbol for his enemies. Any rebellion against him would be fought in their name. The only way to permanently remove them as a threat was to physically eliminate them. For a man who had already seized a throne, killing his rivals might have seemed like a logical, if brutal, next step. It was the standard operating procedure for many medieval rulers. He had the means. He was the king. He controlled the Tower of London. He had loyal servants like Robert Brackenbury and John Howard, who were in direct command of the fortress. He could issue any order and expect it to be obeyed. He could ensure that the crime was carried out in secret and that the evidence was hidden. He had absolute power over the situation. He had the opportunity. The boys were in his possession from June 1483 onwards. He had months to arrange for their deaths at a time of his choosing. He could wait for the right moment when London was quiet, when his power was consolidated, and then act. The case against him is also supported by the actions of those around him. The rebellion of the Duke of Buckingham in October 1483 seems to have been a direct reaction to the prince's fate. The chroniclers of the time, even those who were not direct Tudor propagandists, quickly came to the conclusion that Richard was the murderer. The rumor was widespread and seems to have been generally believed across England and in Europe. The shadow of the crime hung over his entire 2-year reign and contributed to his unpopularity and his eventual downfall at the Battle of Bosworth. But there is also a case for his innocence. The argument is that murdering the princes was actually a terrible political mistake. Richard had already won. He had been crowned king. He had the support of Parliament. The boys were securely locked away and legally disinherited. At that point, they were more valuable to him alive than dead. As long as they were alive and in his custody, he could control them. No one could produce them as a figurehead for a rebellion. But if he killed them, he created a vacuum. He turned them into martyrs, and he opened the door for pretenders to emerge, claiming to be one of the lost princes. The appearance of Perkin Warbeck years later was exactly the kind of problem that was created by the uncertainty surrounding their fate. A smart political operator, it is argued, would have kept the boys alive, perhaps in a comfortable but secure imprisonment in the north of England. The murder also stained him with the unforgivable crime of killing children, and his own kin at that. It destroyed his reputation. It gave his enemies, like Henry Tudor, a powerful propaganda weapon to use against him. Why would he commit an act that was so politically damaging? Some have argued that he was a genuinely pious man, a good lawgiver, and that the murder was completely out of character. They suggest that the story of Richard the Monster was a later invention by the Tudors to blacken his name and justify their own seizure of the throne. This Ricardian view suggests that someone else killed the princes, perhaps Buckingham acting alone or Margaret Beaufort's agents to frame Richard. Ultimately, the strongest evidence against Richard is his own silence. If the princes had died of natural causes, say from an illness, he could have had their bodies displayed in public to prove there was no foul play. If they had escaped, he would have launched a massive nationwide manhunt to find them. But he did neither. He said nothing. He acted as if they had never existed. This official silence from the king, the one man who knew their whereabouts, is deeply incriminating. It suggests a cover-up, and the person with the most reason to cover up a murder is the murderer himself. While other suspects had powerful motives, only Richard had the ultimate authority and the direct responsibility. The buck stopped with him. Number one, what if the skeletons weren't theirs? The entire mystery of the princes in the tower seems to find its grim conclusion in 1674. During renovation work at the Tower of London, laborers digging at the base of a staircase leading to the chapel in the White Tower found a wooden chest. Inside were the skeletons of two children. The location roughly matched the place where Thomas More, writing over 150 years earlier, had claimed the boys were temporarily buried. Everyone assumed the mystery was solved. These were the bodies of Edward V and his brother Richard. King Charles II ordered the remains to be placed in an urn and interred in Westminster Abbey, where they lie today. This discovery has shaped our understanding of the case ever since. It seems to provide the physical proof of the murder. It solidifies the narrative that the boys died in the tower, but we need to ask a critical question. Are we sure those bones belong to the princes? The truth is, we are not. The identification in 1674 was based on assumption, not scientific evidence. The Tower of London has a long and complex history. It has been a fortress, a palace, and a prison for centuries. Many people have lived and died there. Roman remains have been found there. It is entirely possible that the skeletons were of two other children buried at some other time who had nothing to do with the case. The bones were examined again in 1933. The team, consisting of an anatomist and a dental surgeon, concluded that the skeletons were those of two boys whose ages matched those of the princes in 1483. They also claimed, based on some dental evidence, that the two were related. For decades, this was considered definitive proof. The case was closed. However, modern forensic scientists have re-examined the 1933 report and found it to be deeply flawed. The methods used to determine age and relationship were not reliable by today's standards. The conclusions were presented with a certainty that the evidence did not support. The 1933 examination, in essence, simply confirmed what everyone already believed. It was not objective science. This leaves us in a state of profound uncertainty. The most crucial piece of physical evidence in the entire case is questionable. The only way to know for sure would be to conduct a new scientific examination using modern techniques. DNA testing could potentially determine the sex of the individuals, their age at death, with much greater accuracy, and most importantly, whether they were related to each other and to the known DNA of their relative, Richard III, whose remains were discovered in 2012. A DNA test could solve the mystery of the bones once and for all, but permission for such a test has been consistently refused by the authorities who control the royal tombs, both the Church of England and the royal household. The official reason given is that the sanctity of the tomb should be respected, but this refusal has led to suspicion. Why not settle the question? Why not use the tools of modern science to find the truth? The refusal to allow testing implicates our own modern institutions in the perpetuation of the mystery. It prioritizes tradition over truth. It keeps the story in the realm of myth and speculation when it could be grounded in fact. If a new test were done and it proved the bones were not the prince's, the entire historical narrative would be shattered. It would mean the boys did not die in the tower in 1483. It would reopen the possibility that they escaped or were kept alive elsewhere. It would lend huge credibility to the claims of pretenders like Perkin Warbeck. It would completely exonerate Richard III of the charge of murdering them in the tower, though he would still be guilty of their imprisonment and usurpation. The implications would be enormous. The final chapter of this story has not yet been written. It is locked in an urn in Westminster Abbey. Until those bones are tested, every theory, every suspect, every accusation is based on circumstantial evidence and historical accounts written by biased men. The skeletons are a symbol of our own acceptance of a story without definitive proof. The final implication is on us, on our willingness to believe a good story, even when the key evidence remains unverified and the truth is still, after more than 5 centuries, waiting to be discovered.